Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm David Patton, and joining us now is Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, who finds his name increasingly linked to the 2016 GOP race for the presidential nomination. Governor Walker has written a new book, Unintimidated, A Governor's Story and a Nation's Challenge. He is perhaps best remembered for surviving the 2012 recall election in Wisconsin. He joins us now. Governor Walker, good to have you with us.
Great to be back with you.
You were in the headlines quite a bit recently with some observations talking about senatorial eligibility or preference for the nomination for president, the idea that it would be better to pick someone who is a Washington outsider. I wanted to broaden that discussion a little bit because it seems to me that if we're going to apply a rule to the likes of, say, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Rand Paul, Republican senators, shouldn't that also apply on the other side of the aisle? Hillary Clinton, former senator, Elizabeth Warren, a name now being prominently mentioned for the Democratic nomination. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think you're exactly right, and I think that's the contrast out there. One of the things I think a lot of people presume is that Hillary Clinton will be the Democrats' nominee for president, and that was my point, is that I think people have had it with Washington in general. It's part of what I talk about in the book. The optimism I have for America is spurred by born out of the benefits of what governors are doing, not just in our state, but what we're doing all across America. I think people are frustrated with Washington and the lessons we learned, and I talk about many states, in particular in the Midwest, where Republican governors came in 2010 and turned things around, and I think the same thing can be done at the national level.
Now, in your book, one of the points that you make is that on many occasions you actually went out of your way to not be confrontational with Democrats, to try to avoid confrontations, if you will, say the public sector unions. You say that you went out of your way to not go, quote, Chris Christie in Wisconsin. And that actually raises an interesting question. Do you think that the more confrontational style, the upfront, somewhat high volume style of, say, a Chris Christie, would that play in Wisconsin and in the Midwest generally, do you think?
Well, I think any of our Republican governors, there's 30 of us now in America, would do well in the Midwest, in my state and other states out there. Chris and I were actually just the other day on Sunday at the Packers-Giants game together, so I consider him a good friend out there. But my point in the book, actually, I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that there was more to Wisconsin than just the protest and the recall elections, that they'll get a better understanding of what we did and, more importantly, why we did what we did. But it was, there's different times at different places. The example you mentioned about where I said I didn't go Chris Christie was where we literally had a group of Special Olympic athletes outside of the Capitol I was speaking to, and literally hundreds of people dressed as zombies who were protesters in the Capitol came out between me and the Special Olympic athletes. And I really kept the focus on the athletes. A media outlet picked up the videotape of that, and in the end, I think it was one of the many moments that started to turn the tide from what at one point was very strong opposition to what we were doing to, in the end, winning the recall with more votes and by a higher percentage than we had before, because I think a lot of people in my state looked at that and said, that's not who we are, that's not how we act. And that's one of the things, one of the many stories we talk about in the book about how the protesters really took things too far.
So let's compare that success with the shutdown in Wisconsin. You were able to turn a $3.6 billion deficit into a significant surplus. You did that by sticking to your guns in the face of a great deal of controversy. Comparing that, for example, to the shutdown, the grassroots, the conservative movement candidates, got a lot of heat for that whole situation. Are there some lessons about how you handle things in Wisconsin that the grassroots should apply to the national situation? Because it's only a matter of time before we have another sort of shutdown showdown.
Well, one of the things we did in 2010, and we did it not only in Wisconsin, but you look at a lot of other, particularly Midwestern battleground states, we switched everything from Republican to Democrat, both the chief executive and the legislative branches, and that made a world of difference. Obviously in Washington, one of the three legs, the House of Representatives, are controlled by Republicans, but the Senate and the President obviously are Democrats. I look ahead to 2014 and think we've got to make particularly Obamacare the issue in that election, not just because the rollout has failed, but because it is a failure in and of itself, and it's a sign of an overexpansive federal government. And to me, that's where the focus is going to be. Don't let the attention be distracted from that. Allow that to be an issue, because what we learned in Wisconsin, what I talk about at length in our book, is having a Republican legislature, having Republicans in both houses, in our case the Assembly and the Senate, made all the difference in the world because we could get really big, bold reforms done. And that benefited not just Republicans, it benefited the taxpayers as a whole. We need to do that nationally. Make the case for the Senate 14, hold the House, and then hopefully 2 years later, we can really change things with a new Republican president.
Now, in your book, you also make it pretty clear that you handed over to the Mitt Romney organization a finely tuned campaign machine. Plus, they had Paul Ryan on the ticket, and yet they lost to Obama. Obama carried the state by about 7 points, as I recall. Is Wisconsin really winnable for a Republican candidate on the national level, or is it really fool's gold?
Well, and from our standpoint, we looked at Wisconsin, we said, literally the day after the election, that people asked me, could Mitt Romney win? I said, absolutely. If he showed the R next to his name wasn't just for Republican, it stood for reformer. The unfortunate reality is many of the folks, and I talk about this at length as a chapter in my book, just about this campaign in particular, that the Romney campaign, his advisors, I think in many cases have suggested that the campaign should be all about Barack Obama and the failures that the country was seeing under his economy and things like Obamacare. And unfortunately, they didn't give a clear vision of what an America would be like under President Mitt Romney. And so that created a void. And I talked at length in the book, what they allowed the Obama-Biden campaign essentially to do was define Mitt Romney as a guy whose R next to his name didn't just stand for Republican, it stood for rich guy who only cared about other rich guys. That's not Mitt Romney. That's not who he would have been as president. But if you don't fill that void, that's exactly what happens. And so the lesson I talked about in Wisconsin, the lesson that we've talked about at length in our book from other states as well, is that Republican governors are winning because we've got an optimistic vision for the future that includes all of our people, not just those who voted for us. And we talk about it in terms that are relevant, and then we have the courage to go out and act on it.
You have been mentioned and named as a candidate who may be able to bridge that really difficult divide right now between the GOP movement base and the establishment part of the party. That you might be a candidate who can come in and unite those two aspects of the party. Do you think that is a fair characterization of where you are on the political spectrum, and how important is it going to be to unite the party both in 2014 and 2016?
Well, clearly we did that in 2010 in our election and again in 2012, and I'm hopeful when I'm up for my third time as governor in 2014 I can do that, because we were able to talk about our principles, stand by our principles, not back away from them, but do so in a way that appealed to not only Republican and independent voters, but even some discerning Democrats in a state where you need that to win, like Wisconsin, a battleground state. And I think for any of us looking ahead to the future, that's what we're going to need from Republicans. That's why, again, in my book, I tell so many different stories about the optimism I have for state after state where Republican leaders are showing that sort of visionary optimism that really, I think, needs to bring the party together. And we're not seeing that, unfortunately, enough in our nation's capital.
I guess what I'm asking, Governor, is do you believe that while, of course, you're not going to state whether you're going to toss your hat in the ring, do you see any candidate out there who would be better suited than you to bridge those two parts of the party?
Well, I think there's a lot of governors who would do a tremendous job in that regard because they're doing it day in and day out in their states. A lot of former governors that would as well. So I don't think the party in any way is limited with successful chief executives. I do know my case, after having run twice in the last 2 years for governor, I'm pretty focused on doing that. And I think there's a lot of people in my state who are depending on me to do that for quite some time in the future. But my hope would be that sort of leadership is going to come from the ranks of governors all across America.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Obamacare. At last report, I believe there were fewer than 1,000 Wisconsin residents who had joined these, the federal exchanges, the federal marketplace. And I know you recently announced a plan to delay moving some 70,000 state residents into the federal insurance market. How are these so-called glitches affecting Wisconsin right now? And how alarmed are your fellow governors, what you're hearing from other governors, about where we're at as far as the Obamacare situation?
Well, it's a real mess. As of last week, we had less than 877 people signed up. We did not do a state exchange. We have a federal exchange in Wisconsin because that's the law. We did not take the Medicaid expansion. But what we did do was something quite creative. We took everybody living above poverty, and because of the Supreme Court ruling, that was the one part that was favorable, obviously not the other part on the law itself, but it gave the states the right to make decisions, that we could make decisions on our own about Medicaid. We took that and took everybody above poverty and moved them into the marketplace, because some of those individuals, because of their lower income, would probably be dependent on the federal exchange, because it was such an abysmal failure and people clearly weren't going to be signed up and ready to go by the first of the year. Last week I announced that we were going to delay that by 3 months, and said, you know, it would have been easy for me politically to point to that and say, look, this is the failure of the federal government. But I said, in the end, real people would suffer, real people would be in no man's land, real people would suffer by falling between the tracks and all this. And so we said we just weren't going to allow that to happen, that for the interest of the people of our state, we were going to stand up and look out for them despite the miserable failure of the federal government, particularly the Department of Health and Human Services. And I think from other governors I talked to, they're hearing some of the same things all across America, that not only from Republican governors, but even some Democrats who are very, very concerned about how clearly it is that this Obama administration is in over their head and it's just not working. And that's one of our frustrations overall. I talk about in the book is the difference between the failures in Washington and the successes we have by truly making things work, by not just making political statements, but by putting in place real world reforms that are working in state governments. And we're not seeing it in Washington.
Well, that actually brings me to my last question. You're used to being a governor, being an executive, leading in difficult, even controversial times. When we look at President Obama's approval ratings right now, they're at an all-time low. They're pretty close to what George W. Bush's were during the famous Bush fatigue era. Everywhere you turn, Benghazi, foreign policy, Iran, of course, Obamacare, Fast and Furious, et cetera, it seems like just one controversy after another. As an executive who's been able to lead your state through tough times, I wondered what advice you might have to President Obama about how he can perhaps turn things around and kind of get the ship of state sailing properly again.
Well, if I had a direct line into the president, and if he was listening, I'd tell him they needed to back off on Obamacare. That probably more than anything, it's not just a failure in terms of the rollout. It's not just a failure in terms of getting people signed up. It has had an abysmal impact on our nation's economy. We certainly see it in Wisconsin, where we hear employer after employer who are very concerned about the uncertainty that Obamacare brings. And if anything, if he wants to get this country working again, if he wants some stability back, I'd figure out a way to postpone at a minimum. I don't think he'll ever be at a point during his presidency where he's willing to completely repeal, as some have called for, including myself, but at least postpone the start of that, because it's not only not working in terms of a sign-up, it's causing a huge wet blanket on the nation's economy and the possible recovery we would have out there. And my hope is, for all of our sakes, he starts listening to people, not only in the Republican Party, but increasingly more in his own party, who feel the same way.
Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, we know we'll be hearing a lot more about you and your book in the months ahead. Thank you for joining us on Newsmax TV.
Great to be with you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.